Sarah Martinez never imagined that a routine evening jog through Central Park would turn into the most terrifying and empowering 60 seconds of her life. What happened that autumn night would not only change her forever, but also make headlines across the country, sparking conversations about self-defense, survival instincts, and the incredible strength that emerges when ordinary people face extraordinary danger. The crisp October air filled Sarah's lungs as she maintained her steady pace along the winding path through Central Park. At 28, she had been running these same routes for nearly 5 years, ever since moving to Manhattan for her marketing job at a tech startup. The familiar rhythm of her sneakers against the asphalt provided a meditative backdrop to her thoughts as she processed another demanding day at the office. Sarah had always been athletic, but her dedication to fitness went beyond mere hobby. Growing up in a military family, her father had instilled in her the importance of physical conditioning and mental toughness. Colonel James Martinez had served 3 tours overseas before retiring, and he made sure his daughter understood that strength came not just from muscles, but from discipline, preparation, and the unwavering belief that she could handle whatever life threw at her. The park was unusually quiet for a Thursday evening. Most of the after-work joggers had already completed their routes, and the tourist crowds had thinned out as dinner time approached. Sarah preferred these quieter moments when she could push herself harder without weaving through clusters of slow-moving pedestrians or dodging cyclists who seemed oblivious to the designated running lanes. As she rounded a bend near the reservoir, the distant rumble of motorcycle engines caught her attention. The sound grew louder, more aggressive, cutting through the peaceful ambience of the park like a chainsaw through silk. Sarah glanced over her shoulder and saw 5 motorcycles approaching on the main road that bordered this section of the park. The riders wore dark leather jackets and bandanas covering their faces, their bikes modified with loud exhaust pipes that announced their presence with territorial authority. Something about their formation and the way they slowed down as they passed her position made Sarah's instincts prickle with unease. She had learned to trust these gut feelings, a lesson reinforced by countless conversations with her father about situational awareness. The military had taught him that survival often depended on recognizing danger before it fully materialized, and he had passed this wisdom along to his daughter through years of patient guidance. The motorcycles pulled over to a parking area about 50 yards ahead of her intended route. Sarah watched as the 5 riders dismounted, their movements deliberate and coordinated in a way that suggested this was not a casual stop to admire the scenery. They positioned themselves between her current location and the main exit from this section of the park, effectively creating a barrier that would force her to either turn back or find an alternative path. Sarah's pace slowed as she evaluated her options. She could reverse course and take the longer route back to her apartment, but something told her that showing fear or changing her routine might actually encourage whatever intentions these men harbored. Her father had often spoken about the psychology of predators, explaining how they typically targeted individuals who appeared vulnerable or easily intimidated. Instead of turning back, Sarah decided to maintain her course but heightened her awareness of everything around her. She noted the exact position of each rider, memorized their physical characteristics as best she could from a distance, and began mentally cataloging potential weapons or defensive tools within her immediate environment. The park maintenance crew had left a small pile of construction materials near a path renovation project, about 20 feet to her right. She spotted what appeared to be metal rebar, loose chunks of concrete, and several wooden stakes that had been used to mark boundaries. The men seemed to be engaged in animated conversation, occasionally pointing in her direction and laughing in a way that made her skin crawl. Sarah's military upbringing had exposed her to enough rough characters to recognize the particular brand of aggressive masculinity that often preceded trouble. These were not simply motorcycle enthusiasts taking a break from their evening ride. As she drew closer, details became clearer. The leader appeared to be a heavy-set man with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos. His leather jacket bore patches that suggested affiliation with a motorcycle club, though Sarah could not make out the specific insignia from her current distance. The other 4 varied in size and build, but all shared the same predatory energy that seemed to radiate from their group dynamic. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Her father had enrolled her in self-defense classes starting at age 12, not because he expected her to face dangerous situations, but because he believed every person should possess the skills and confidence to protect themselves if necessary. Over the years, she had studied everything from basic martial arts to advanced defensive tactics, always with the understanding that the best fight was the one you never had to engage in. But sometimes, fights chose you regardless of your preferences. The leader raised his hand in what might have appeared to be a friendly greeting to casual observers, but Sarah recognized it as a signal to his companions. The 5 men began spreading out across the width of the path, creating an unmistakable barrier that would force any passerby to either stop and interact with them or attempt to go around through more difficult terrain. Sarah's breathing remained steady, but her heart rate increased as adrenaline began flooding her system. She had read extensively about the body's fight-or-flight response and understood that this physiological reaction could either enhance her performance or paralyze her with fear, depending on how well she managed it. Years of training had taught her to channel adrenaline into focused energy rather than allowing it to overwhelm her decision-making capabilities. The distance between Sarah and the group continued to shrink with each step. She estimated roughly 30 seconds before she would reach their position, assuming she maintained her current pace. During those 30 seconds, she would need to make critical decisions about how to handle whatever confrontation awaited her. Part of her mind catalogued escape routes and defensive positions, while another part remained focused on reading the body language and positioning of the 5 men. She noticed that 2 of them kept glancing toward the wooded area off to the left side of the path, suggesting they might be planning to force her into that more isolated section, where any struggle would be hidden from potential witnesses. The park's emergency call boxes were positioned at regular intervals, but Sarah calculated that the nearest one was approximately 100 yards behind her current position. Even if she could reach it and successfully contact park security or police, response times in this area typically ranged from 5 to 10 minutes, depending on officer availability and current call volume. Far too long to be useful in an immediate crisis situation. Sarah's options crystallized as she approached the 15-second mark before contact. She could attempt to run past them, hoping their motorcycles were not positioned to pursue her effectively. She could try to de-escalate whatever confrontation they intended through conversation and negotiation. Or she could prepare for the possibility that violence was inevitable and position herself to respond with maximum effectiveness. The leader stepped forward from the group, his intentions becoming unmistakably clear as he blocked the center of the path. His companions moved to flank him, creating a wall of intimidating masculine presence that was clearly designed to overwhelm and control. "Evening, sweetheart," the leader called out, his tone carrying false friendliness that fooled no one. "Beautiful night for a run, don't you think?" Maybe a little too beautiful for a young lady to be out here all alone. Sarah's father had warned her about this exact type of approach. Predators often began with seemingly innocent conversation designed to gauge their target's vulnerability and establish psychological dominance. The key was to respond in a way that projected confidence and awareness without unnecessarily escalating the situation. "Good evening," Sarah replied in a clear, steady voice that carried just far enough to potentially alert any other park users who might be within hearing range. She did not slow her pace, but also did not attempt to run, maintaining the appearance of someone who was alert but not panicked. "Hold on there," another voice called out. This came from one of the flanking riders, a lanky man with a shaved head and multiple facial piercings. "We just want to have a friendly conversation. No need to be in such a hurry." The group began closing their formation, making it clear that they did not intend to allow her to pass without some form of interaction. Sarah's training told her that this was the critical moment when the situation would either de-escalate or explode into violence. Everything she had learned over years of preparation was about to be tested in the most real-world way possible. Sarah stopped approximately 10 feet from the leader, far enough to maintain some reaction time, but close enough to project confidence rather than fear. She planted her feet in a balanced stance that would allow quick movement in any direction, and kept her hands visible but ready to defend herself if necessary. "I appreciate the conversation," she said, her voice carrying the kind of polite firmness that indicated she was not easily intimidated. "But I need to finish my run and get home. I'm sure you gentlemen understand." The leader's expression shifted from false friendliness to something much more sinister. "Actually, we don't understand. You see, we've been watching you run through here for several weeks now, and we thought it was time we properly introduced ourselves. The thing is, a young woman like yourself shouldn't be out here alone after dark. All sorts of dangerous people around these days." The threat was unmistakable now, delivered with the kind of casual menace that suggested these men had done this before. Sarah's mind raced through potential responses while her body prepared for whatever action might become necessary. "I appreciate your concern," she replied, maintaining steady eye contact with the leader while keeping the others in her peripheral vision, "but I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. Now, if you'll excuse me." She took a step forward, testing their response and making it clear that she intended to continue on her path. The leader immediately moved to block her more aggressively, while his companions closed in from the sides. "That's where you're wrong, sweetheart," the leader said, his voice dropping to a more threatening tone. "Nobody's perfectly capable of taking care of themselves against 5 guys like us. But don't worry, we'll take real good care of you." The other 4 men laughed at this comment, the sound harsh and predatory in the growing darkness. Sarah realized that the situation had moved beyond any possibility of peaceful resolution. These men intended to harm her, and the only question remaining was how effectively she could defend herself against overwhelming odds. Her father's voice echoed in her memory from countless training sessions. When violence becomes inevitable, the only ethical response is to end it as quickly and decisively as possible. Every second you hesitate is another second your attacker has to hurt you or someone else. Sarah's breathing deepened as she shifted into combat mindset. Years of training had taught her that successful self-defense against multiple attackers required speed, aggression, and the element of surprise. She would need to disable or discourage as many of them as possible before they could coordinate their attack effectively. The leader reached toward her, his intention clearly to grab her arm or shoulder and establish physical control. This was the moment Sarah had trained for her entire adult life, the moment when all the theory and practice would either save her life or prove inadequate against real-world violence. As his hand moved toward her, Sarah's training took over completely. Her body responded with the fluid precision that came from years of repetitive practice, muscle memory overriding conscious thought as she prepared to fight for her life against 5 men who had made the fatal mistake of underestimating exactly who they had chosen to attack. Sarah's response was instantaneous and devastating. As the leader's hand reached for her shoulder, she stepped into his movement rather than away from it. A counterintuitive action that caught him completely off guard. Her right hand shot upward in a precise palm strike that connected with the soft cartilage of his nose, while simultaneously her left hand grabbed his extending wrist and used his own forward momentum to pull him off balance. The sound of breaking cartilage was audible even over the ambient noise of the park. Blood immediately began streaming down the leader's face as he stumbled backward, his hands instinctively moving to protect his injured nose. Sarah didn't pause to admire handiwork. She had learned that in multiple attacker scenarios, hesitation meant death. Before the other 4 men could process what had just happened to their leader, Sarah was already moving toward the second closest threat. The lanky man with facial piercings was reaching inside his jacket, possibly for a weapon, when Sarah's knee drove upward into his solar plexus with the full force of her momentum behind it. The strike lifted him completely off his feet and sent him crashing into one of his companions. Sarah's father had taught her that fighting multiple opponents was like playing speed chess with life-or-death consequences. Every move had to serve multiple purposes, creating opportunities while eliminating threats. Her strike on the second attacker had been calculated not just to disable him, but to use his falling body as an obstacle for the man behind him. The remaining 3 attackers were now fully alert to the danger they faced, but their coordination had been shattered by the sudden violence. They had expected an easy victim, not someone capable of putting 2 of their companions out of action within the first 5 seconds of contact. Sarah used their momentary confusion to her advantage. She pivoted toward the construction materials she had spotted earlier, her movement fluid and purposeful. One of the remaining attackers, a stocky man with a thick neck and multiple tattoos covering his arms, lunged forward to tackle her before she could reach any potential weapons. Sarah's response demonstrated years of grappling training. As the man committed to his tackle, she dropped her center of gravity and used his momentum against him, executing a hip toss that sent him flying over her shoulder. The technique was textbook perfect, utilizing leverage and timing rather than brute strength to redirect his attack energy. The man hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping like a fish out of water. Sarah immediately followed up with a precise kick to his temple, ensuring he would not be rejoining the fight anytime soon. The strike was delivered with clinical efficiency, designed to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. 2 attackers remained active, but their confidence had evaporated completely. They found themselves facing someone who moved with the fluid precision of a trained fighter, someone who had turned their planned ambush into a nightmare scenario where they were being systematically dismantled by their intended victim. The 4th attacker, a thin man with nervous energy and twitchy movements, produced a knife from his jacket pocket. The blade caught the light from nearby park lamps as he held it in front of him with shaking hands. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking with fear and adrenaline. "I'll cut you up, I swear." Sarah's expression remained calm despite the escalation in weapons. Her father had spent considerable time teaching her knife defense, emphasizing that edged weapons required a completely different mindset and approach than unarmed combat. The key principles were distance management, timing, and the acceptance that injury was likely but death was avoidable with proper technique. "You don't want to do this," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of steady confidence that came from someone who had trained extensively for exactly this scenario. You've seen what I can do to your friends. Put the knife down and walk away, and nobody else has to get hurt. The man with the knife glanced quickly at his fallen companions. The leader was still on his knees, blood streaming from his broken nose and his eyes watering uncontrollably. The lanky man was curled in a fetal position, clutching his ribs and making small whimpering sounds. The stocky man lay completely motionless, his breathing shallow but steady. "She's just one person," the fifth attacker said, trying to rally his knife-wielding companion. This last man was the largest of the group, easily 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing well over 200 pounds. His size had probably intimidated many people in the past, but Sarah evaluated him with the clinical eye of someone who understood that size could be both an advantage and a vulnerability, depending on how it was utilized. The large man moved forward with more caution than his companions had shown, clearly having learned from their mistakes. His approach was methodical, designed to use his reach and strength advantages while minimizing his exposure to the kind of quick strikes that had disabled the others. Sarah recognized the tactical shift in her opponent's strategy. The knife wielder would try to keep her at distance and create openings for his large companion to use overwhelming force. This was actually a reasonably intelligent approach, and it meant she needed to disrupt their coordination quickly before they could implement their plan effectively. Sarah feinted toward the knife wielder, drawing his attention and causing him to thrust the blade toward her midsection. Instead of retreating, she stepped inside the arc of his attack, grabbing his wrist with both hands and using a textbook disarm technique that twisted his arm until the knife clattered to the ground. The movement was executed with such speed and precision that the man barely had time to register what was happening before his weapon was gone. The large man chose this moment to attack, assuming Sarah would be distracted by the disarm. His massive hands reached for her throat, intending to use his size advantage to overpower her through brute force. Sarah ducked under his grasping hands and drove her elbow upward into his ribs, targeting the floating ribs that were particularly vulnerable to precise strikes. The impact was devastating. Despite his size and apparent toughness, the large man doubled over in pain as the targeted strike disrupted his breathing and sent shockwaves through his nervous system. Sarah immediately followed up with an uppercut that connected cleanly with his chin, snapping his head back and sending him stumbling backward until he tripped over one of his fallen companions. The knife wielder, now disarmed and facing the prospect of continuing the fight empty-handed against someone who had just defeated 4 armed opponents, made the intelligent decision to run. He turned and sprinted toward the motorcycles, clearly intending to escape before Sarah could focus her attention on him. Sarah let him go. Her father's training had emphasized the importance of knowing when to pursue and when to allow retreat. The immediate threat had been neutralized, and chasing down a fleeing opponent might expose her to additional dangers or separate her from the crime scene before authorities could arrive. She quickly surveyed the aftermath of the confrontation. 4 men lay on the ground in various states of consciousness and injury. The leader was slowly struggling to his feet, blood still streaming from his broken nose, but his eyes clearing as the initial shock of the strike began to wear off. The lanky man remained curled up, protecting his injured ribs and abdomen. The stocky man was beginning to stir, groaning softly as consciousness gradually returned. The large man sat against a tree, holding his ribs and looking at Sarah with a mixture of pain and newfound respect. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 60 seconds, from the first physical contact to the final opponent's decision to flee. Sarah's heart was still racing, but her breathing remained controlled and her movements stayed fluid and ready. The adrenaline that had fueled her defensive actions was now beginning to transition into the post-combat awareness that would help her process what had just occurred. "Anyone who wants to leave should do it now," Sarah announced in a clear voice that carried across the immediate area. "The police are on their way, and I imagine some of you would prefer not to explain to them why you thought it would be fun to attack a woman who was minding her own business." This was a calculated bluff, as Sarah had not yet had the opportunity to contact law enforcement, but it served the psychological purpose of encouraging the remaining attackers to focus on escape rather than continuing hostilities. Her father had taught her that the minutes immediately following a defensive encounter were often as dangerous as the initial attack, since injured and humiliated assailants might attempt to re-establish their dominance through continued violence. The leader, still holding his broken nose, looked around at his fallen companions and seemed to be calculating whether continued confrontation would be worthwhile. Blood was smeared across his face and shirt, and his eyes had already begun to swell from the impact to his nasal area. The sight of his thoroughly defeated crew clearly influenced his decision-making process. "This isn't over," he muttered, but his tone lacked conviction. The threat sounded more like something he felt obligated to say, rather than a genuine promise of future retaliation. Sarah recognized the psychology behind such face-saving gestures and chose not to respond, understanding that engaging with his wounded pride might escalate the situation unnecessarily. The stocky man managed to pull himself to his feet, swaying slightly as he fought off the effects of the kick to his head. He looked at Sarah with a mixture of confusion and wariness, clearly struggling to reconcile his expectations about how this encounter should have proceeded with the reality of what had actually occurred. "Come on," the leader said to his remaining conscious companions. "Let's get out of here." The large man attempted to stand, but immediately sat back down as pain shot through his injured ribs. "I think she broke something," he wheezed, his voice strained with the effort of speaking. Sarah maintained her defensive posture as the conscious attackers helped their more severely injured companions toward their motorcycles. She watched their movements carefully, ready to respond if anyone decided to make a final attempt at revenge or retaliation. Her positioning allowed her quick access to the construction materials she had identified earlier, while maintaining clear sightlines to all the potential threats. The sound of approaching sirens began to echo through the park, growing steadily louder as emergency responders made their way toward the area. Sarah allowed herself a small smile as she realized that her bluff about contacting police was about to become reality. Apparently, someone else in the park had witnessed at least part of the confrontation and had the presence of mind to call for help. The leader looked up at the sound of the sirens and his expression shifted from angry determination to urgent concern. "We need to go now," he told his companions, abandoning any pretense of casual departure. The group's movements became hurried and uncoordinated as they struggled to get their injured members onto motorcycles and prepare for a hasty escape. Sarah pulled out her phone and dialed 911, knowing that official documentation of the incident would be important for both legal and personal protection purposes. As the call connected, she began mentally organizing the details she would need to provide to responding officers, ensuring that her account would be clear, accurate, and focused on the factual sequence of events rather than emotional interpretation. The motorcycles roared to life as the attackers prepared their escape, the sound harsh and aggressive in the quiet park environment. Sarah watched them pull away from the scene, noting license plate numbers, and memorizing as many identifying details as possible for later reporting to authorities. As the sound of their engines faded into the distance, Sarah found herself alone in the park, with only the approaching sirens and her own steady breathing for company. The confrontation was over, but the real challenges were just beginning. She would need to explain to police officers how her evening jog had turned into a 5-on-1 fight that left her completely unharmed, while her attackers fled the scene nursing various injuries. More importantly, she would need to process the psychological and emotional impact of having been forced to use violence against multiple attackers in a situation that could easily have resulted in serious injury or death. Her training had prepared her for the physical aspects of such an encounter, but dealing with the aftermath would require a different kind of strength and resilience. The first police car arrived within minutes, its red and blue lights cutting through the growing darkness of the park. Officer Maria Santos stepped out of the vehicle with the cautious awareness of someone responding to a reported assault, her hand resting near her service weapon as she surveyed the scene for potential threats. What she found was a young woman in running clothes standing calmly near what appeared to be evidence of a significant struggle. Scattered construction materials, disturbed ground, and small patches of blood told a story of violence. But the lone figure waiting for her arrival seemed remarkably composed for someone who had allegedly been attacked by multiple assailants. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Santos," she announced, approaching with professional courtesy, but maintaining tactical awareness. "We received a call about an assault in progress. Are you injured? Do you need medical attention?" Sarah shook her head while maintaining the alert posture that had served her well during the confrontation. "I'm not injured, officer. I was attacked by 5 men on motorcycles, but I was able to defend myself. They fled the scene just before you arrived." Officer Santos studied Sarah's appearance more closely. Her running clothes were slightly disheveled but showed no signs of tearing or blood. Her breathing was elevated but controlled, consistent with recent physical exertion rather than panic or shock. Most notably, she exhibited none of the typical indicators of someone who had just experienced a traumatic assault. "Can you describe what happened?" Officer Santos asked while pulling out her notepad. She positioned herself where she could maintain visual contact with Sarah, while keeping an eye on the surrounding area in case the attackers returned or additional threats emerged. Sarah provided a clear, chronological account of the evening's events, from her initial observation of the motorcycles through the final departure of her attackers. She spoke in the measured tone of someone who had mentally rehearsed the important details and understood the importance of accurate reporting for potential legal proceedings. As Sarah spoke, Officer Santos found herself increasingly impressed by the witness's composure and attention to detail. Most assault victims struggled to provide coherent accounts of traumatic events, particularly when multiple attackers and weapons were involved. Sarah's narrative was logical, specific, and delivered without the emotional fluctuations that typically accompanied such testimony. "You said you were able to defend yourself against 5 attackers," Officer Santos said when Sarah finished her account. "Can you describe your training background? Most people don't successfully fight off multiple armed assailants." Sarah explained her military family background and the extensive self-defense training she had received throughout her life. She described the various martial arts disciplines she had studied and her father's philosophy about preparedness and situational awareness. Officer Santos listened with growing understanding of how this particular victim had been able to turn a potentially deadly encounter into a successful self-defense situation. Additional police units began arriving as backup, their presence transforming the quiet park area into a crime scene, with proper security and investigation protocols. Officer Santos coordinated with her colleagues to establish a perimeter and begin collecting physical evidence, while continuing her interview with Sarah. Detective James Chen arrived approximately 20 minutes after the initial police response. A 15-year veteran of the force with extensive experience in assault cases, he had seen enough victims to recognize when someone's account didn't match typical patterns. Sarah's calm demeanor and detailed recollection immediately caught his attention. "Miss Martinez," Detective Chen said after introducing himself, "I'd like to walk through the scene with you and get your perspective on exactly where events occurred. Sometimes seeing the physical location helps witnesses remember additional details that might be important for our investigation." Sarah agreed and began retracing her steps from the initial sighting of the motorcycles through the final confrontation. She pointed out the construction materials she had identified as potential weapons, described the positioning of each attacker during different phases of the encounter, and provided specific details about the techniques she had used to defend herself. Detective Chen followed along, occasionally asking questions about timing, distances, and specific actions. His experience told him that Sarah's account was both credible and remarkably precise for someone who had just experienced a high-stress violent encounter. The physical evidence supported her narrative, and her descriptions of defensive techniques demonstrated genuine knowledge rather than fabricated claims.
"Can you estimate how long the entire physical confrontation lasted?" Detective Chen asked as they concluded their walkthrough.
"Less than 60 seconds from first contact to when the last attacker stopped fighting," Sarah replied without hesitation. "Probably closer to 45 seconds for the actual combat, though the verbal exchange beforehand lasted several minutes." Detective Chen nodded, making notes about the timeline. In his experience, successful self-defense against multiple attackers required exactly the kind of speed and decisiveness that Sarah described. Prolonged fights typically favored the attackers due to their numerical advantage. The crime scene investigation continued for over an hour, as officers collected evidence, took photographs, and documented the physical indicators of the struggle. Small blood samples were found in 3 different locations, consistent with Sarah's account of injuries she had inflicted on her attackers.
Scuff marks in the dirt showed signs of the rapid movement and physical contact she had described.
"We'll need you to come to the station to provide a formal statement," Detective Chen explained to Sarah as the on-scene investigation concluded.
"We'll also want to have our sketch artist work with you to create composite drawings of the attackers. Your descriptions are detailed enough that we might be able to identify these individuals." Sarah agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation, understanding that her case could potentially help prevent these men from attacking other victims in the future. She also recognized that thorough documentation would be important if the attackers were eventually apprehended and criminal charges were filed. The drive to the police station gave Sarah her first opportunity to begin processing the emotional impact of what had occurred. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation and initial police response was beginning to fade, replaced by the complex mixture of relief, satisfaction, and lingering alertness that followed successful self-defense. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her father, who had an uncanny ability to sense when his daughter might need support. "Hope your evening run went well. Remember that situational awareness is your best defense. Love you, kiddo." Sarah smiled at the timing of his message, knowing that she would have quite a story to share with him soon. At the police station, Sarah spent another 2 hours providing a detailed formal statement and working with a sketch artist to create visual representations of her attackers. The artist was impressed by Sarah's memory for faces and specific details, noting that most witnesses struggled to provide such precise descriptions after traumatic encounters. Your training really shows, the sketch artist commented as they completed the final drawing. Most people focus on the weapons or the most threatening attacker and miss details about the others. You've given us enough detail to potentially identify all 5 men. Detective Chen reviewed the completed sketches and formal statement, cross-referencing details with existing criminal databases and recent reports of similar attacks. Sarah's case had several unique elements that made it particularly valuable for investigative purposes, including the detailed descriptions, the specific location, and the unusual outcome. We'll be in touch if we identify any suspects or need additional information, Detective Chen assured Sarah as she prepared to leave the station. In the meantime, I want you to know that your actions tonight probably prevented these men from attacking other victims. Cases like yours help us build patterns that lead to arrests. The taxi ride back to her apartment gave Sarah additional time to reflect on the evening's events. She felt a deep sense of gratitude for her father's insistence on comprehensive training. Understanding now why he had invested so much time and energy in preparing her for dangerous situations she hoped never to encounter. More than that, she felt a profound appreciation for the mental conditioning that had allowed her to remain calm and focused under extreme pressure. The physical techniques had been important, but her ability to think clearly and make tactical decisions had probably been the decisive factor in her successful defense. Sarah's apartment felt like a sanctuary as she finally returned home nearly 4 hours after what should have been a routine evening jog. She immediately called her father to share the night's events, knowing that he would want to hear about how his training principles had translated into real-world application. "I'm proud of you, but not surprised," Colonel Martinez said after listening to Sarah's detailed account. "You did exactly what you were trained to do. You stayed calm, assessed the situation, and responded with appropriate force. Most importantly, you recognized when the threat was neutralized and didn't pursue unnecessary conflict." They discussed the tactical aspects of the confrontation for nearly an hour, with her father asking probing questions about her decision-making process and the effectiveness of different techniques. He was particularly interested in how she had managed the transition from situational awareness to active combat, noting that many trained individuals struggled with that psychological shift. "The most important thing to remember," he concluded, "is that this situation chose you, not the other way around. You didn't go looking for trouble, but when trouble found you, you were prepared to handle it responsibly. That's exactly what training is supposed to accomplish." Sarah spent the remainder of the evening documenting her own recollections of the event, while details were still fresh in her memory. She understood that criminal proceedings might require her testimony months in the future, and she wanted to preserve accurate records of her observations and actions. As she prepared for bed, Sarah realized that her perspective on personal safety had evolved significantly in the span of a single evening. The theoretical knowledge she had gained through years of training had been validated through successful practical application, giving her a new level of confidence in her ability to handle dangerous situations. At the same time, she felt a sobering awareness of how quickly routine activities could transform into life-threatening encounters. The park where she had jogged safely hundreds of times had become the scene of a violent confrontation that could easily have resulted in serious injury or death. Sarah's phone rang as she was brushing her teeth, the caller ID showing her mother's number. News of the incident had somehow reached her parents' social circle, probably through law enforcement connections that persisted from her father's military career. "Sweetheart, are you all right?" her mother asked immediately upon hearing Sarah's voice. "We heard there was some kind of incident at the park. Your father is ready to drive up there right now if you need anything." Sarah reassured her mother that she was physically unharmed and emotionally stable, explaining that the training her father had provided had proven invaluable in a real-world situation. She appreciated her parents' concern, but emphasized that she felt capable of handling the aftermath independently. "We raised you to be strong and self-reliant," her mother said with obvious pride in her voice. "But that doesn't mean you have to handle everything alone. If you need to talk through what happened, or if you just want company for a few days, we're here for you." The conversation with her parents helped Sarah recognize that processing traumatic events was often as important as surviving them in the first place. While she felt emotionally stable and confident about her actions, she understood that professional counseling might be helpful in fully integrating the experience. As Sarah finally settled into bed, she reflected on the randomness of violence and the importance of preparation for unlikely but potentially catastrophic events. Her evening jog had been transformed into a validation of years of training, but it had also served as a reminder that predators existed in even the most civilized environments. The last thought that crossed her mind before falling asleep was gratitude for the outcome and a renewed commitment to maintaining the skills and awareness that had saved her life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as word of the incident spread, and she navigated the social and professional implications of her newfound reputation as someone who had successfully defended herself against overwhelming odds. Sarah woke the next morning to discover that her quiet evening of self-defense had somehow become front-page news. Her phone displayed 17 missed calls and countless text messages from friends, colleagues, and family members who had seen the early morning news reports about the incident in Central Park. The local news had picked up the story from police scanner traffic and transformed it into a human interest piece about a woman who had successfully defended herself against 5 motorcycle-riding attackers. The reporting was generally accurate, though sensationalized, with headlines like "Woman defeats 5 attackers in Central Park battle" and "Martial arts training saves runner from gang attack." Sarah's first instinct was to avoid the media attention entirely, but Detective Chen called before she could formulate a strategy for handling the publicity. The investigation had developed significantly overnight, and he needed her input on several important developments. "We've had 3 separate tips identifying potential suspects based on the sketches you helped create," Detective Chen explained during their phone conversation. "2 of the tips came from people who recognized the same individual, which gives us confidence that we're on the right track. Can you come in this afternoon to look at some photographs?" Sarah agreed to continue cooperating with the investigation, understanding that identifying her attackers was important both for her own safety and for preventing future crimes. She also recognized that her unique position as a victim who had successfully defended herself gave her case additional investigative value. The photo identification session at the police station was more emotionally challenging than Sarah had anticipated. Seeing clear photographs of the men who had intended to harm her brought back the intensity of the confrontation in a way that surprised her with its psychological impact. "That's him," Sarah said immediately upon seeing the 4th photograph in the series.
The image showed the bearded leader of the group, his face displaying the kind of casual arrogance that she remembered from their brief verbal exchange.
That's definitely the one who did most of the talking. Detective Chen made notes about her identification while pulling up additional information about the suspect.
"His name is Marcus Vega, and he's got a lengthy record of assault, robbery, and intimidation charges. He's associated with a motorcycle club that's been linked to several similar incidents over the past 2 years." The investigation file that Detective Chen shared with Sarah painted a disturbing picture of organized predatory behavior. The group had apparently been targeting lone joggers, cyclists, and walkers in various parks around the city, using intimidation and violence to rob their victims and worse. Sarah's successful defense had broken a pattern that had been escalating in both frequency and severity. "Your case is unique because you fought back effectively," Detective Chen explained. "Most of their previous victims were too intimidated or overwhelmed to resist, which meant we had very few useful descriptions and no physical evidence of the attackers' identities. Your defensive actions left blood evidence and provided us with detailed suspect descriptions for the first time." Sarah felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and concern as she learned about the broader criminal pattern. Her training had not only saved her from becoming a victim, but had potentially prevented numerous future attacks by giving law enforcement the evidence needed to pursue these predators. The media attention intensified throughout the day as additional news outlets picked up the story. Sarah's workplace became a circus of reporters and cameras as journalists sought interviews and background information about the woman who had become an overnight sensation for her self-defense success. Sarah's boss, Jennifer Walsh, called her into a private meeting to discuss how to handle the publicity without disrupting the company's business operations. "We're proud of you and we want to support you however we can," Jennifer explained, "but we also need to manage the media attention so it doesn't become a distraction for other employees." They agreed that Sarah would work from home for the remainder of the week while the initial media frenzy died down. Her colleagues had been uniformly supportive, but the constant stream of reporters and camera crews in the building lobby was creating disruptions that affected everyone's productivity. Sarah's apartment building was similarly besieged by media attention. Reporters had somehow obtained her address and were stationed in the lobby, hoping to catch her for spontaneous interviews. The building management was not pleased with the disruption, but they were legally limited in their ability to restrict media access to public areas. The phone calls from media outlets were relentless. Producers from national morning shows wanted her to appear as a guest to discuss self-defense and personal safety. Publishers were interested in book deals about her training background and survival story. Film producers inquired about adaptation rights for what they saw as an inspiring story of triumph over adversity. Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of her private life into public entertainment. She had never sought attention for her training or preparedness, viewing them simply as practical skills that responsible adults should possess. The idea that her defensive actions had become a source of fascination for strangers felt surreal and uncomfortable. Her father called that evening with advice about managing media attention based on his military experience with public relations. The key is to control the narrative by being selective about which interviews you grant and what information you share, he explained. Remember that anything you say will be edited and interpreted by people who weren't there and don't understand the context. They discussed the potential benefits and drawbacks of media engagement. Speaking publicly about her experience could help promote awareness of personal safety and self-defense training, potentially helping other people avoid becoming victims. However, extensive media exposure also came with privacy costs and the risk of attracting unwanted attention from people with questionable motivations. The most important thing, Colonel Martinez concluded, is to remember that you don't owe anyone your story. You survived a dangerous situation through preparation and skill, but that doesn't obligate you to become a public speaker or celebrity. Do what feels right for you, not what other people think you should do. Detective Chen called again that evening with news that the investigation had progressed to arrest warrants for 3 of the 5 attackers. The blood evidence collected from the scene had been matched to DNA profiles in the criminal database, providing conclusive identification of several suspects. We expect to make arrests within the next 48 hours, Detective Chen informed Sarah. The suspects we've identified have extensive criminal records, and the evidence from your case is strong enough to support serious felony charges. Your willingness to fight back and provide detailed descriptions has made this one of our most solid cases in recent memory. Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction knowing that her actions would result in criminal consequences for her attackers. The investigation had validated her decision to resist rather than submit, demonstrating that defensive training could have impacts far beyond individual survival. The arrest announcements generated another wave of media attention, this time focusing on the criminal backgrounds of the suspects and the broader pattern of attacks they had allegedly committed. Sarah's case was being hailed as a turning point in the investigation of what prosecutors were calling an organized criminal conspiracy. Local women's groups began reaching out to Sarah, hoping she would speak at self-defense workshops and safety seminars. The organization saw her story as a powerful example of the effectiveness of proper training, and wanted to use her experience to encourage other women to take proactive steps toward personal protection. Sarah found these requests more appealing than the media interviews, since they aligned with her genuine interest in helping other people develop the skills and confidence needed to protect themselves. However, she was careful to avoid making commitments while still processing the emotional aftermath of her own experience. Dr. Patricia Williams, a trauma counselor who specialized in working with crime victims, reached out through Detective Chen to offer her services. Even when self-defense is successful, the psychological impact of a violent encounter can be significant, Dr. Williams explained during their initial phone conversation. Processing the experience with a professional can help ensure that you integrate it in a healthy way. Sarah scheduled an appointment for the following week, recognizing that professional guidance might help her navigate the complex emotions surrounding the incident. While she felt proud of her successful defense, she also experienced moments of anxiety about potential retaliation and concern about the long-term implications of having been forced to use violence. The counseling session provided Sarah with valuable perspective on the normalcy of her emotional responses and practical strategies for managing ongoing concerns about personal safety. Dr. Williams helped her understand that successful self-defense often created psychological challenges that were different from, but just as important as those experienced by victims who were unable to resist. You demonstrated remarkable skill and composure under extreme pressure, Dr. Williams observed, but that doesn't mean you're immune to the psychological impact of having been targeted for violence. Processing these experiences is part of maintaining your emotional health and ensuring that this incident strengthens rather than traumatizes you. The investigation continued to develop throughout the week as additional evidence was collected and analyzed. The 3 suspects who had been arrested provided information that led to the identification and capture of the 4th attacker, leaving only the one who had fled the scene still at large. Marcus Vega, the group's leader, initially attempted to claim self-defense, arguing that Sarah had attacked him without provocation.